In 1891, inside a private Rockefeller residence, a household inventory was found, torn, stained, and missing sections, an administrative record meant to be clean, complete, and routine. It wasn't destroyed, it was left damaged, as if someone wanted it unusable without making it disappear. This video examines the torn inventory of the Rockefeller Mansion and the Rockefeller family's paper trail in 1891. The controversy is simple. A document that should have been ordinary was deliberately compromised, and the condition it survived in is not accidental. One concrete piece of evidence sits at the center of this case. A physical household inventory dated 1891, kept outside the official circuit, discovered incomplete, ripped, stained, and quietly preserved in a state that makes it hard to read, harder to verify, and easiest to dismiss. To understand why that matters, you have to remember what the late 19th century demanded from names like Rockefeller. This was the age when industry was becoming power, and power was becoming something the public tried to measure, criticize, and restrain. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, an event that signaled a new appetite for confronting concentrated wealth and a new vulnerability for any dynasty whose reputation depended on looking orderly, legitimate, and beyond suspicion. For families operating at that level, public image wasn't a vanity project, it was a form of defense. The press didn't need access to a boardroom to shape perception. Sometimes it only needed a small, credible detail that suggested the private world was less controlled than the public story. That is why an inventory, domestic, administrative, seemingly harmless, can become combustible. Inventories are not written for drama. They exist to make a household legible. What was there? What belonged where? What could be accounted for? They are the kind of record that should survive in neutral condition because their value is in completeness. When you find one physically damaged, yet not eliminated, you are forced into a narrower question than, what's the mystery? You have to ask, what would make someone choose sabotage over absence? Choose a partial record over no record at all? If there's a ledger, a box, or a door in your life that still bothers you years later, say what it was, and subscribe so you don't miss the next file. And if this intrigues you, leave a like. Because in a world where legacy is curated as carefully as fortune, the most revealing act is often the smallest correction made in private when nobody is supposed to be watching. The inventory didn't vanish. It stayed, damaged, inside the boundaries of a family world built on control. And that is where the record begins, with a torn, stained 1891 inventory laid out like evidence on a quiet table. The first piece did not surface during an official audit, nor through any cataloged recovery. It appeared because someone opened the wrong box. In 1936, an archivist named Leland Morrison was reclassifying property files in the Westchester storage wing of the Rockefeller estate. The boxes were stacked in metal shelving units, each labeled with accession codes from the 1920s reorganization project. One of them, marked only personal household, unverified, contained loose correspondence, yellowed receipts, and at the bottom, a smaller box without a tag. When Morrison lifted its lid, he found fragments of paper wrapped in a linen handkerchief, edges brittle, ink bleached to a faint brown. The handwriting matched a clerical style from the 1890s, with the long S and the angular capital R used by domestic accountants of the time. At first, the find seemed irrelevant, a private inventory with damage consistent with humidity or neglect. But as Morrison aligned the torn edges on a flat surface, it became evident that the cuts were intentional. They followed the shape of specific names and valuations, as if the document had been censored with a blade, not aged into decay. Under magnification, the ink patterns revealed smears that overlapped rather than spread outward, showing that liquid had been applied after the writing, not before. One stain obscured a surname beginning with B, another covered an entry for guest silverware, imported. The rest of the list remained legible: furniture totals, staff uniforms, carriage maintenance. The paper's watermark placed its manufacture between 1888 and 1892, aligning with the family's expansion phase, when John D. Rockefeller commissioned architects to update multiple properties simultaneously. That detail alone established the inventory's temporal authenticity. Yet its existence outside the primary ledger system contradicted the estate's own archiving protocols, standardized in 1904, when the family foundation began centralizing all domestic records under controlled accession numbers. No file of that era was supposed to remain in a personal container, especially not one bearing financial annotations. In March 1936, Morrison cross-checked the surviving pages against intact inventories preserved in the library annex. Two matched dates, April 16 and May 3, 1891, appeared in multiple ledgers, but only one referenced an additional valuation of imported furnishings. The corresponding page in the damaged inventory ended precisely where that note should have continued. The absence was not random. It was engineered. Each excision fell along lines where assets were itemized with associated suppliers. Removing those names eliminated the paper trail between acquisition and accounting, leaving only totals that could not be verified. Institutionally, this mattered. Since 1911, the Rockefeller family had faced ongoing press scrutiny following the Standard Oil antitrust verdict. Their public philanthropy, colleges, churches, medical research, was meant to counterbalance accusations of monopolistic excess. A document revealing undisclosed domestic acquisitions in 1891, if tied to post-verdict revaluation, could revive claims that family wealth was quietly transferred through private holdings rather than corporate dissolution. The torn inventory, if authentic, would suggest that even household documentation was curated to project austerity. The archivist's immediate action was procedural. He noted the item's discovery in his report to the estate's internal historian, filed under irregular domestic record. The note was short, factual, and unsigned. An omission unusual in an environment obsessed with accountability. Within 2 weeks, the box was resealed and moved to a higher security shelf, accompanied by a typed slip reading "Retain for handwriting analysis." No analysis followed. The paper simply stayed there, unconsulted, until its rediscovery decades later during a preservation survey. What made the case conclusive was not speculation, but replication. A modern forensics review in 1978 at Columbia University confirmed the ink compounds, dated to the same chemical batch used by Harrison and Sons in New York around 1890. The mutilation, therefore, could not have been recent tampering. It originated from the period itself. The selective tearing aligned with entries that involved external contractors, names absent from the surviving estate ledgers. The missing information represented transactions, not decor. Their removal erased accountability. The immediate consequence was institutional rather than criminal, a quiet decision by the family trust to treat the box as artifact, not evidence. Labeling it that way neutralized its interpretive danger. An artifact can be admired, not investigated. The discovery, therefore, re-entered the archive under control, authenticated but depoliticized. It is impossible to know whether Morrison understood the implications of what he found, but the record of his hesitation remains in a marginal note. Not accident, pattern deliberate. That phrase is the hinge of the entire case, because once a pattern is confirmed, a motive must exist, even if it remains unnamed. If you ever handled a document that seemed too careful in its damage, what would you have done? Filed it, or questioned it? And that is where the torn inventory re-enters the timeline, its fragments laid out not as relics but as the first verifiable evidence that the damage was designed, not endured. To understand why a damaged household inventory could represent danger in 1891, one must first step into the psychology of the Gilded Age, an era defined not only by wealth but by the obsessive choreography of appearing respectable while maintaining control over the origins of that wealth. Between 1880 and 1900, as railways, steel, and oil built the backbone of modern America, the press built its own empire of exposure. The New York World and Harper's Weekly learned that the public hungered for stories that pierced the facades of dynastic families. The Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Vanderbilts understood that reputation had become a new currency, one that fluctuated as violently as the market itself. In that environment, a simple household document could hold the same volatility as a share certificate. By 1891, the Rockefeller family had already begun shifting from pure industrial operations to philanthropic theater, funding churches, libraries, and universities as a counterbalance to the moral backlash against monopoly. Yet philanthropy required a double architecture, a public structure of virtue and a private scaffolding of discretion. Every servant list, imported purchase, or unrecorded expense could betray the distance between those two constructions. Domestic inventories, which listed every object, supplier, and appraiser involved in maintaining a mansion, were more than administrative paperwork. They were mirrors of lifestyle, and, by extension, evidence of moral standing. The cultural tension of the decade can be read in legal language. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been enacted in 1890 to curb restraints of trade, but its effect extended beyond business. It inaugurated a national fascination with private excess, with journalists translating corporate opacity into domestic metaphor. Trust became a moral accusation, and anything labeled secret, ledgers, contracts, even household accounts, could be presented as proof of corruption. Within that climate, the discovery of a separate, unfiled inventory was not a curiosity, it was a liability. It documented possession, and possession in that era meant moral exposure. Objects themselves carried reputational risk. Imported art or furnishings from European estates often implied relationships with brokers linked to speculative financing. In the Rockefeller case, a mention of imported furnishings in the 1891 ledger might have pointed to transactions routed through intermediaries involved in questionable tariff schemes. When newspapers such as the New York Tribune began tracing family expenditures to political influence, any documentation that named foreign suppliers or unrecorded gifts could undermine the narrative of disciplined Protestant virtue the Rockefellers cultivated. For a dynasty defining itself by temperance and stewardship, an over-decorated drawing room could read as theological hypocrisy. The family's estates were laboratories of discretion. In 1891, the mansion at 4 West 54th Street in Manhattan served as both home and symbol, large enough to display influence, restrained enough to avoid Vanderbilt-style spectacle. Every object within its walls existed under the eye of both servants and visitors. To manage perception, the Rockefellers applied the logic of business secrecy to private life. Separation of documentation. Official inventories, those kept by estate accountants, were prepared for insurance and taxation. Unofficial lists, often drafted by domestic supervisors, were meant only for internal control. If an unofficial list recorded an object or donation that contradicted the official version, the discrepancy could become a scandal in waiting. There are records from 1893, 2 years after the torn inventory's date, showing that the family's lawyers quietly requested reclassification of certain decorative items as temporary acquisitions. The phrasing is deliberately neutral, but in administrative terms it meant those objects were to disappear from taxable domestic assets without requiring proof of sale. The language of moral purity, simplicity, frugality, stewardship, thus rested on an accounting strategy that could not withstand literal transparency. The danger lay not in what the items were, but in what their paper trail revealed about the system that produced them. Public morality at the time conflated visibility with virtue. A philanthropist could be accused of vanity if his generosity appeared too calculated, yet condemned as secretive if it seemed concealed. This double bind created a fragile equilibrium, the destruction, or selective mutilation, of household documentation was a form of damage control, not rebellion. Tearing pages or blotting names transformed a potentially compromising artifact into something ambiguous, plausible, deniable. It allowed a record to survive as evidence of order while withholding the information that could indict it. In this light, The 1891 inventory's damage is historically coherent. Certain pages were removed because they contained names, perhaps suppliers, perhaps recipients, that linked the household economy to industrial capital still under public scrutiny after the Standard Oil hearings. The stains over specific entries suggest that ink was used to obscure rather than accidental spillage. It was, in essence, a reputational firewall built out of cellulose and discretion. The social cost of failure was immense. In 1895, only 4 years later, McClure's magazine published Ida Tarbell's first exposés on Standard Oil's inner mechanisms, and the Rockefeller name became shorthand for both genius and manipulation. The family could not risk any paper trail, however domestic, contradicting their new narrative of moral ascendancy. To the public, they were constructing universities. To historians, they were constructing invisibility. The consequence of this culture of caution was institutional as much as personal. When archivists decades later categorized the torn inventory as an artifact, they unknowingly reenacted the very logic of the era, neutralizing something dangerous by aestheticizing it. What was once a liability became a collectible. What once implied moral risk became a piece of heritage. By 1891, a candlestick could imply speculation, a ledger entry could suggest collusion, and a painting could question piety. The moral landscape was so tightly wound that even silence had to be choreographed. A missing page was safer than an honest one, a smudge safer than a signature. The record closes this section with a small, concrete image, a folded sheet, ink darkened. At its edges, resting beneath a paperweight engraved with the Rockefeller crest. The weight preserves what the knife once tried to erase, a quiet reminder that during the Gilded Age, the greatest danger to a dynasty was not exposure itself, but the paper capable of recording it. The decision to intervene was not made impulsively. It was processed, recorded, and executed through language designed to conceal intent. Sometime between late 1892 and early 1893, before the Rockefeller estate's next formal valuation, a quiet administrative choice transformed an internal document into a controlled liability. The paper trail leading to that decision does not mention names. It only records acts, items retained, lines amended, and, most revealingly, pages adjusted for consistency. The phrasing is bureaucratic, but its effect was irreversible. The surviving correspondence between the household's chief steward, Henry L. Atwater, and the firm of Strong and Alden, trustees responsible for the U.C. family's domestic accounts, shows the context of that moment. In January 1893, Atwater received instructions to review inventories for irregular entries prior to consolidation. No anomalies are specified. However, on February 12th of that year, an addendum notes that duplicate sheets of 1891 inventory may be destroyed once reconciled. This was 1 month before a scheduled audit by the family's legal counsel, an audit meant to prepare statements for both insurance and estate taxation. The action that followed was not destruction in the conventional sense. It was modification. Instead of discarding the inventory and producing a new version, Atwater, or someone under his supervision, opted to alter the existing one. The handwriting identified by later analysts shows 2 distinct inks: the original iron gall ink used by the domestic clerk in 1891 and a darker, denser formulation introduced in 1892. The darker ink corresponds exactly to the replacement annotations found near the tears and stains. Whoever handled it decided that amendment through mutilation was safer than replacement. Replacement would have required new signatures and verification from the trustees. Amendment could masquerade as preservation. Within the logic of 1890's estate management, that distinction mattered. Every ledger bore witness to hierarchy. Servants documented, stewards verified, trustees approved, and lawyers archived. For the Rockefellers, whose fortune and moral image were entangled, rewriting meant exposure to review. Editing meant discretion. The shift from faithful record to controlled narrative began here. in a moment when accountability was transformed into risk. It is possible to reconstruct the pressures leading to that decision. In 1892, the New York World ran an exposé titled "Homes of the Oil Kings," describing the private extravagance of industrial leaders in contrast with their public claims of modest living. The Rockefeller residence was spared direct mention, but the article named families in their social orbit. The resulting anxiety was measurable. Correspondence from Standard Oil's private office that same spring includes internal memos advising executives to avoid visibility in personal acquisitions. Domestic staff would have been aware that the inventory, if ever disclosed, could contradict the official story of restraint. Atwater's position was precarious. As household steward, he managed not only furniture and staff, but also the paper skeleton of the home's credibility. His letters to Strong and Alden read like those of a man asked to perform a correction without being given permission to acknowledge it. Where discrepancies appear, he writes in March 1893, shall they be excised or rewritten? The response, preserved in the trustee's copybook, is chillingly direct. Excise, where rewriting invites inquiry. That single instruction captures the entire philosophy of the alteration. Better to remove evidence imperfectly than to recreate it honestly. By choosing physical intervention, tearing, blotting, selective inking, the estate avoided generating a new object that might require explanation. The altered inventory remained the original, its authority intact but its integrity compromised. Once this logic took hold, the document ceased to be neutral. It became an instrument of containment, a defensive artifact. Its continued presence in the household archive served not to preserve truth, but to absorb it. The consequence was immediate and measurable. When the 1893 valuation was completed, the total household assets reported for the West 54th Street mansion dropped by nearly 9% from the 1891 estimate, despite several known additions. Furniture from European craftsmen recorded in correspondence vanished from the tally. No sales receipts exist. The missing value simply evaporated into administrative abstraction. Financially, the family benefited through reduced exposure to insurance and tax scrutiny. Socially, they reinforced the image of restraint. Institutionally, they established a precedent for what could be quietly omitted in the name of discretion. Historians later examining the handwriting found further evidence of the decision's deliberateness. Certain corrections use the same stylistic flourishes as Atwater's own receipts, suggesting his direct involvement. More telling is a note attached to the household ledger dated August 1893, written in the hand of legal advisor William H. Winslow. Domestic. Record aligned with current declarations. The phrase "aligned with" replaces what earlier drafts of such memos used to call "verified by." Language itself had shifted from the pursuit of accuracy to the enforcement of consistency. It is here that the transition becomes moral as much as procedural. A record that once existed to confirm possession now existed to prevent contradiction. Within the walls of the Rockefeller mansion, paper ceased to be a mirror of reality and became a filter for it. Each omission was small, surgical, justified as a safeguard. Collectively, they marked the beginning of a tradition, the silent curation of evidence to match an ideal. The year 1893 thus stands as the hinge between documentation and narrative. The family's estate accountants, pressured by growing media hostility, began to treat every number as potential ammunition for critics. The inventory's physical alteration was the first visible symptom of that new paranoia. It was not ordered by court, nor compelled by scandal. It was self-imposed, an act of preventive damage control executed before accusation could arise. One can imagine the scene. Atwater at his desk in the West study, the gas lamp flickering over neat stacks of paper, a small knife used to trim parchment edges. The decision, when it came, would not have required a meeting or confession, only a silent understanding among those who managed the flow of information. A cut along the margin, a deliberate blot, a careful refolding of the page. The action was minimal, the consequence enduring. The following morning, the revised pages were dried, pressed, and reinserted into the binding. On the outer edge, no difference was visible. But under lamplight, the scars caught the reflection, lines of disruption beneath a surface of order. It was the perfect metaphor for a family learning to live within its own myth. And that is where the next phase begins, with a document no longer damaged by time but by decision, a record that survived not because it was protected, but because it was edited to fit the shape of its own preservation. The physical alteration of the 1891 Rockefeller Household Inventory is among the few acts within the archive that leave visible evidence of intent. Unlike disappearance, which leaves absence as its only trace, alteration leaves marks, decisions materialized in fiber, ink, and numbering. The surviving pages tell a sequence of interventions that can be dated, measured, and compared with unmodified ledgers from the same decade. Together they reveal a document that was not accidentally damaged but curated into imperfection. When conservators examined the inventory during the 1978 Columbia Review, they compared it with two intact household registers, one from 1889, catalogued as Westchester Domestic Accounts, Volume 4, and another from 1893, Consolidated Household Ledger. Those volumes share a common format: item number, description, source, and valuation, all handwritten in a row. Clean vertical alignment. Each page carries a watermark and a pre-printed border used by R. Worthington & Cohen, a New York stationer that supplied ledger books to upper-class estates. The torn inventory matches that design exactly, proving it once belonged to the same institutional order. Yet under magnification, the differences emerge. Whole sections of the 1891 book have been surgically removed along inner margins, leaving thin ridges of paper fibers, not accidental frays, but clean extractions. Made with a blade thinner than scissors, the sequence of missing leaves interrupts the natural numbering of the pages, which runs from 47 to 50 and then jumps directly to 53. The binding thread at that gap shows resewing, indicating the missing sheets were cut before rebinding. In inventories from 1889 and 1893, the numbering continues without interruption. That single inconsistency anchors the alteration between those two dates, most likely 1892-1893, aligning with the administrative instructions issued to Henry L. Atwater after the family's internal audit. Other interventions are more surgical. Across surviving pages, lines containing suppliers' names are covered by irregular streaks of darkened ink. Spectrographic testing in 1978 showed a high concentration of tannic acid inconsistent with the original iron gall ink, meaning the smears were applied later. The affected lines cluster around luxury imports, Venetian glassware, French tapestries, and silver service acquired through intermediaries. Curiously, the valuations next to them remain untouched. Whoever altered the ledger chose to protect numerical totals, useful for internal balance, while erasing the identities of those who supplied or received the goods. Even the damage bears hierarchy. Pages listing servants' uniforms, stable expenses, and domestic repairs remain pristine. The cuts and stains appear only where the house intersects with commerce, precisely the points where the domestic record met the industrial network that sustained it. By choosing to edit those links instead of replacing the entire ledger, the stewards maintained the illusion of continuity. The handwriting still belonged to 1891, the totals still matched the insurance declarations, and the book itself still occupied its shelf in the estate library. But its content had shifted from evidence to artifact, from witness to performance. In an undamaged 1890 inventory from the Vanderbilt archives, similar acquisitions are described in elaborate detail: names of European craftsmen, shipping routes, and insurance valuations. The Rockefeller version, post-alteration, reads like a skeletonized imitation, headings intact, columns aligned, but entries abbreviated to single nouns: carpet, mirror, painting, with no provenance. This deliberate minimalism was not stylistic, it was protective. Removing context neutralized risk. The document's remaining structure became a mask of bureaucratic order, concealing the erasure underneath. What was left visible is almost as revealing as what vanished. The numbering of objects continues uninterrupted, even across the missing sections. That means each removal had to be compensated by renumbering subsequent entries, a subtle but time-consuming act that implies authorization, not vandalism. Someone cared enough to maintain internal coherence while mutilating substance. The partial survival of section headers, drawing room, east parlor, dining service, suggests a calculated effort to keep the framework recognizable, so the ledger would not trigger suspicion when consulted by auditors or heirs. The damage, in short, was aestheticized to appear accidental, convincing to anyone not comparing it line by line with contemporaneous volumes. The 1978 analysis also noted traces of graphite under some overwriting, faint numbering consistent with preliminary pencil drafts used before ink transcription. Those pencil remnants stop abruptly halfway through the book, where the ink changes color. The interruption indicates a substitution mid-process. Earlier drafts continued in graphite beneath ink. Later ones were erased altogether. The paper fibers in those later pages show light scorching, evidence of contact with a heated metal instrument. Perhaps the blade of a letter opener warmed over a lamp flame to soften dried glue and detach bound sheets. The material record thus captures not a single act of defacement, but a sequence: heating, cutting, staining, resewing, a methodical editorial process. The institutional consequence of this alteration extended far beyond aesthetics. When the next valuation was filed in 1893, auditors from Strong and Alden noted minor inconsistencies in record completeness, but accepted the ledger as valid. Their report added that domestic listings conform with prior declarations. That phrase legitimized the doctored version and established its legal continuity. By treating the mutilated ledger as the same object, the trustees effectively ratified the erasure. What began as a household decision became an institutional endorsement of selective truth. From that point forward, the inventory entered a different ontological category, a document that signals absence by design. Every tear, blot, and missing line became part of its grammar. To read it is to read around silence. The altered pages teach a paradox familiar to archivists, that omission can carry as much meaning as inscription. In historical terms, the Rockefeller Inventory embodies the moment when invisibility became strategy. If silence is engineered, rather than incidental, can it still be considered neutral? Is the absence of a name less revealing than its presence? The altered ledger seems to answer in the affirmative. Its physical form whispers what its words can no longer say. That control was worth more than transparency, and that even damage could be curated into narrative order. On the final intact page, the handwriting straightens as if to conclude a story. Below the last line, China service, quantity adjusted, there is a faint crease where another sheet once lay. The impression of vanished text remains pressed into the paper, shallow but permanent, like a memory refusing to fade. That indentation closes this phase of the investigation, a document that has been cut, inked, and resewn into compliance, leaving behind not chaos but precision, the quiet geometry of a ledger rebuilt to hide itself. When the 1891 inventory was altered, the question of motive was implicit, but by tracing the chain of custody, the hands that handled, reclassified, and preserved the ledger, it becomes possible to see who truly gained from its incompleteness. Every omission, every blot, every removed supplier's name served a strategic purpose: to detach certain possessions from the identity of John D. Rockefeller and his family, while keeping control over those assets intact. The beneficiaries were not a single person but an ecosystem: the family, the trustees who managed its estates, and the legal instruments that insulated wealth from scrutiny. The timing is crucial. Between 1893 and 1896, the Rockefeller holdings underwent what internal memoranda describe as portfolio rationalization, a term introduced by the law firm Strong and Alden, the same trustees involved in Atwater's correspondence about the inventory. This period coincided with the first wave of public outrage against industrial monopolies, sparked by congressional hearings on Standard Oil's practices. The family's response was to shift from direct ownership to layers of intermediaries, family trusts, private partnerships, and donation-based transfers that maintain control without legal exposure. The altered household inventory, seemingly trivial, fit perfectly into this transition. The act of omission transformed personal property, furniture, artworks, imported items, into untraceable categories. Objects once purchased in Rockefeller's name were now listed without attribution or origin, allowing them to pass quietly into new registries. Many reappeared in 1894 as assets of charitable foundations or as donations in kind to institutions funded by the family. The record no longer connected those gifts to their domestic origins. The result was a reputational firewall: generosity without ostentation, detachment without loss. Henry L. Atwater's signature never appears again after 1894. Instead, the ledgers bear the initials of CMW, later identified as Charles M. Wilcox, a financial officer attached to the Standard Oil Trust. His role extended beyond accounting. In surviving correspondence dated May 1894, Wilcox reports to William H. Winslow, the family's legal advisor, that certain domestic valuations have been absorbed under external trusts per the March directives. The wording is dry, administrative, but what it describes is the reclassification of private property as trust assets, effectively moving them out of the family's personal estate. The damaged inventory made that transfer untraceable. It erased the chain of provenance connecting object to owner. The legal consequence was subtle yet powerful. Under New York's 1892 property statutes, trust-held items could not be taxed as part of a private estate if their ownership was undetermined at the time of assessment. A smudged or incomplete record could thus prevent taxation altogether. In 1895, an internal memorandum within the Rockefeller offices noted that household furnishings and imported objects previously assessed as domestic assets are to be retained within trust property until further notice. The altered inventory had fulfilled its administrative purpose. It created the appearance of uncertainty, allowing trustees to claim ambiguity as a defense. Socially, the benefits were no less significant. During the 1890s, public resentment toward ostentatious wealth reached a peak. Newspapers published columns mocking palatial absurdities, while reformers like Henry George denounced the moral corruption of luxury. The Rockefellers cultivated a reputation of piety and restraint. Every photograph of their homes emphasized simplicity over splendor. A complete, detailed inventory, naming foreign suppliers, custom commissions, or extravagant materials, would have contradicted that image. By leaving the document incomplete but intact, they preserved the symbol of order while removing its capacity to betray excess. Institutionally, the trust mechanism became the ultimate beneficiary. The fewer direct attachments between names and assets, the stronger the legal autonomy of the trustees. The damaged ledger helped solidify this firewall. When later audits required evidence of transfer, trustees could point to the altered inventory and claim administrative discontinuity. There was no proof that an object listed in 1891 was the same one held in 1894, and thus no taxable continuity. The torn paper functioned as a legal smokescreen, a document whose imperfections provided plausible deniability. The family's philanthropic empire also profited. In 1896, shortly after the General Education Board was conceived, a set of anonymous donations appeared in its records. Furniture, paintings, and silver of European origin, all categorized simply as private contributions. Scholars reviewing those archives in the 20th century noted that many of these objects matched descriptions faintly visible in the damaged Rockefeller inventory. The pattern suggested a quiet laundering of luxury into philanthropy. The incomplete document ensured that these transitions left no traceable path. For the trustees, the reward was protection. Strong and Alden's internal billing ledgers, preserved in part at Columbia's Avery Library, reveal a significant uptick in advisory retainers during 1893-1895. Their role was not merely legal, it was custodial, ensuring that the paper architecture of wealth reflected the new philosophy of distance. The same firm later advised other industrial dynasties on document neutralization, a euphemism for precisely the kind of administrative pruning visible in the Rockefeller Inventory. In effect, a model was born. The true genius of the alteration was that it did not erase ownership. It erased evidence of ownership. The Rockefellers continued to live among the same objects, maintain the same estates, and enjoy the same comforts. Only the trail connecting them to those possessions was thinned to near transparency. In a world where visibility equated to liability, the incomplete document became a shield. The institutional ripple extended even further. When the Rockefeller Foundation was formally chartered in 1913, its founding statement included a clause about transfers of property of indeterminate domestic origin. The language inherited from earlier trust documents shows the long tail of that 1891 intervention. The principle was clear: what could not be precisely proven could not be precisely taxed or accused. In this sense, the first beneficiary of the torn inventory was not a person, but a system that learned to convert ambiguity into protection. The altered ledger's silence became a form of strategy. Where a complete record could incriminate, an incomplete one could exonerate. Trustees gained plausible deniability. The family gained moral insulation. The institutions gained structural immunity. Together, they formed a triad of beneficiaries bound not by conspiracy, but by shared interest in incompleteness. If power, as the Gilded Age proved, depended on controlling perception as much as possession, then the damaged inventory served as both tool and metaphor. It allowed the Rockefellers to remain seen as stewards rather than magnates, their home a disciplined household rather than a vault of extravagance. The omissions were not errors, they were design. On the final surviving page of the 1891 ledger, a notation appears in the margin, faintly legible under ultraviolet light. Resolved, domestic valuations conform to trust assets, March 1894. The handwriting is Wilcox's. It is the only explicit acknowledgement of the inventory's repurposing. The line is thin, almost casual, yet it closes the circle of intent. With that single adjustment, the household record ceased to describe possession and began to document strategy. The paper rests today in its protective sleeve at the Rockefeller Archive Center, its edges browned, its text fragmented, its purpose fulfilled. Every missing line represents a decision rewarded, every stain a legacy preserved. The ledger no longer protects a family from scandal. It protects an institution from memory. And in that quiet success lies its final beneficiary, the idea that history itself can be edited to remain intact. The story of the torn Rockefeller inventory reaches its quietest and most irreversible stage between 1891 and 1895, the period in which disappearance became method. What was once alteration turned, by design, into deletion. The traces that remain are not the things themselves, but their negative spaces. Empty columns where words once stood, ink halos outlining vanished letters, and numbering that leaps across missing pages as though refusing to acknowledge loss. It is in these absences that the investigation finds its most eloquent evidence. The physical disappearance occurred gradually, not in a single night or through a fire, but through controlled subtraction. Each year between 1892 and 1895 saw routine household revisions at the Rockefeller Mansion on West 54th Street in Manhattan, where staff inventories were reconciled against trustee ledgers. Surviving administrative memoranda refer to domestic redundancies resolved and records harmonized with trust accounting. In the language of the Gilded Age bureaucracy, these phrases meant something precise: removal. Whole sections of household documentation were culled to eliminate what no longer served legal or reputational function. By cross-referencing existing inventories from nearby estates, specifically the Vanderbilt 1890 domestic ledger and the 1893 Astor family accounts, it is possible to estimate what should have existed in the missing Rockefeller pages. The pattern of enumeration shows that the destroyed sections correspond to three major rooms: the North Gallery, the West Salon, and a smaller anteroom adjoining the library. These were the only spaces known to contain items purchased through European intermediaries, objects that blended art, industry, and speculation. Their omission is too coherent to be accidental. A surviving insurance register from 1891, housed in the New York Mutual Assurance Archives, lists artworks described as Italian Oils Private, valued at $12,600. No such artworks appear in later inventories or estate claims. By 1895, the number of registered paintings in the Rockefeller domestic holdings drops from 24 to 15, even as the overall valuation remains unchanged. The absent 9 were not sold. They were reclassified out of existence. The supporting paperwork, bills of sale, certificates of authenticity, and appraisals would have been stored alongside the household inventory. Their absence today mirrors the tears in the ledger itself. Among the most telling details is the loss of cross-references. Early inventories contained notations connecting household items to purchase orders or maintenance logs. In the damaged 1891 volume, those cross-references stop midway through the sequence. The clerical code, C. Fuller 72, appears, but folio 72 is gone. It is not simply that the data disappeared. The mechanism for verifying it was amputated. The inventory no longer interacted with any other record, isolating itself within an archive built to appear whole. This systematic disappearance extended to spatial nomenclature. Later estate blueprints omit the North Gallery entirely, renaming it Upper Passage, ATE. Linguistic erasure that mirrored the physical removal of its contents from documentation. The Rockefeller family papers from 1894 make a single passing reference to unused space converted to private storage. The phrasing is vague, but architectural records show no such renovation. Instead, the disappearance of the gallery from both architectural and documentary evidence suggests a coordinated effort to delink the space from institutional memory. A room can vanish as effectively on paper as in stone. Between 1891 and 1895, this pattern of controlled vanishing produced a subtle but measurable consequence. The household inventory lost approximately 14% of its entries, yet its total valuation remained stable within a margin of 1%. Mathematically, this indicates that the removed items were of high value, objects whose absence required inflation of remaining estimates to maintain consistency. In bureaucratic terms, the ledger was rebalanced. In historical terms, it was hollowed. Institutionally, the disappearance served multiple layers of protection. The trustees avoided having to reconcile potentially problematic assets with tax assessments. The family avoided embarrassment should their domestic acquisitions contradict public declarations of modesty, and the estate managers gained procedural efficiency by reducing the archive's complexity. But the deeper consequence was historical. The missing information now distorts our understanding of the late 19th century domestic world, a world meticulously documented elsewhere but selectively erased here. What vanished with those names and rooms is a map of taste, trade, and private ideology. The date of the last confirmed disappearance can be fixed with precision. In June 1895, a clerk for Strong and Alden filed a ledger compliance summary, noting that domestic inventories reflect updated holdings per 1893-94 audit. After that, the household inventory is no longer mentioned in correspondence. Its administrative function had ended. Its evidentiary function had been neutralized. From that moment, the missing sections ceased to exist, not as damaged material, but as bureaucratic void. No longer something to be restored, merely something to be ignored. Archival practice of the time reinforced this transformation. By categorizing the incomplete ledger as non-essential domestic record, the trustees effectively sanctioned its mutilation. In 1904, when the Rockefeller estate centralized its papers under the family foundation, the surviving ledger was boxed among miscellaneous accounts. No recovery effort was ever attempted. The disappearance had achieved permanence. For historians, the loss is not simply quantitative. The missing names of craftsmen, suppliers, and domestic staff erase the socio-economic microcosm that surrounded the mansion's construction. Each absent line was a potential thread linking the family's private world to the industrial machinery that financed it. Their removal severs that continuity. The Rockefeller household, once a living index of the Gilded Age economy, now exists in the record as a sanitized abstraction. Rooms without origins, objects without provenance, possession without context. The disappearance also carried an epistemic consequence. By allowing gaps to remain visible but unexplained, the altered ledger teaches future readers to normalize incompleteness. In this sense, the loss becomes self-perpetuating. Researchers treat the silence as a limit rather than a clue. The act of forgetting embeds itself in the method of remembrance. Still, fragments resist total erasure. One damaged page, numbered 49, preserves a faint indentation where a longer list once continued. Under oblique light, the ghost of a word emerges. Gallery. No ink remains, only the pressure of the pen upon paper. That single imprint stands as the ledger's final witness, the echo of a vanished room. And so, the inventory, once a mirror of possession, becomes a record of absence. What left the page between 1891 and 1895 cannot be restored, only traced through the voids it left behind. Each tear is now both wound and testimony, marking the exact frontier where history meets its deliberate forgetting. By the time archivists began cross-checking the Rockefeller household inventory against parallel ledgers, the damage had already matured into contradiction. What survived no longer aligned with anything else from the same year. The numbers and words on those pages resist reconciliation. They don't add up, and they don't agree. Between 1891 and 1893, arithmetic itself became a form of disguise. The earliest sign of inconsistency appears in a routine ledger compiled by Strong and Alden, the family's accounting trustees. Dated October 1891, it records, domestic expenditures West 54th Street, listing total household assets valued at $147,200. Yet the inventory from that same season, supposedly derived from identical data, arrives at $139,175. No correction note appears, no rounding explanation, no entry for depreciation. In that decade, such discrepancies were not small mistakes, they were statements of control. The missing $7,225 represents neither arithmetic negligence nor clerical fatigue. It represents the quiet subtraction of traceability. Every other surviving Rockefeller document from that fiscal year reinforces the anomaly. In the 1891 household cash book, lines of payment to European suppliers total $8,040. None of those expenses appear anywhere in the modified inventory, where they should have been cross-referenced, under imported furnishings, gallery valuations, or parlor acquisitions. There are gaps, blank lines, or rewritten totals in darker ink. The 1978 Forensic Review at Columbia University identified these sections by their density of overwriting. The ink there absorbed more deeply into the page, suggesting later entry. The inconsistencies are not random. They form a pattern of protection. Items that could link the Rockefeller name to foreign importers or high-value artisans are precisely those whose valuations vanish or mutate. The arithmetic across categories reveals it. In 1891, the ledger lists 53 paintings. By 1893, only 44 remain recorded, yet the total insured value rises 11%. Either the missing paintings multiplied in worth after they were erased, or the surviving ones were inflated to compensate. Both interpretations point to conscious editing. At least, one clerk appears to have noticed. A marginal note on the 1893 summary sheet, written in a neat but uneasy hand, reads, "Totals diverge from insurance form. Confirm basis of adjustment." The note bears the initials HLA, Henry L. Atwater, the household steward already implicated in earlier modifications. The query was never answered. Instead, the following quarter's report substitutes a new phrase: domestic assets harmonized with declarations. The verb harmonized replaced confirmed, a linguistic shift that, even in administrative prose, signals transition from accuracy to conformity. By 1894, the bookkeeping irregularities spread outward. The trustee's financial summary for personal property, non-corporate, lists 3 subcategories newly introduced that year: reclassified furnishings, unidentified holdings, and adjusted domestic valuation. None of these exist in comparable ledgers from the Vanderbilt, Morgan, or Astor archives. Their creation coincides exactly with the years the Rockefeller Inventory was being pared down. Numbers once stable became fluid. Columns that used to represent real objects became placeholders for discretion. When historians reconstructed the arithmetic decades later, they found the imbalance reproducible only through deliberate misalignment. The totals balance internally, but not externally. Inside the damaged ledger, sums add correctly because they were recomputed after deletion. But when compared to bank ledgers and insurance certificates from 1891, the deficits return. It is the paper equivalent of a palimpsest, neat on its own surface, incoherent when held against its reflection. What exposes the intent most clearly are the surviving arithmetic marks, pencil figures in the margins of the 1891 inventory, some smudged but legible under infrared scanning. They represent preliminary additions of each room's content. In several places, the penciled totals exceed the inked ones by narrow but telling margins. $512 becomes $470, $1,360 becomes $1,200. The corrections all trend downward. No clerical error consistently favors subtraction unless subtraction is the goal. The inconsistencies also infiltrate narrative sections. The dining service category lists 48 pieces of silver under a heading dated April 1891. In the next line, a note in darker ink adds, adjusted to 42 pieces. Yet in 1892, an insurance renewal still covers 48 items. The household thus paid premiums on goods that, on paper, no longer existed. That duality, absence in one record, presence in another, demonstrates the dual bookkeeping typical of estates guarding their privacy, one version for audit, another for continuity. Institutionally, the discrepancies achieved what direct concealment could not. Because the numbers within the ledger balanced, external auditors had no reason to suspect tampering. The internal coherence created external confusion. Legally, there was no contradiction. Each document was internally true, but mutually exclusive. Financially, it prevented alignment between tax assessment, insurance valuation, and domestic inventory, ensuring that no single reviewer could reconstruct total wealth. In 1895, when the household accounts were folded into the family's consolidated trust, the inconsistency hardened into permanence. The new charter adopted the altered totals as baseline values. The missing $7,000 from 1891 became the family's official record of corrected assets. From that point forward, all subsequent inventories referenced those falsified numbers, replicating the distortion across decades of bookkeeping. The social consequence was subtler yet enduring. When journalists later scrutinized Rockefeller's fortune in the early 1900s, they encountered only neat, balanced figures that suggested probity and restraint. The irregular arithmetic had been buried under the illusion of mathematical order. The inventory's inconsistencies became invisible precisely because they were consistent with themselves. Technically, the cross-comparison leaves no doubt that editing occurred. Page 63 of the surviving ledger contains an addition error so improbable it could only have been transcribed from a recalculation, not an oversight. The sum of 3 values, $180, $245, and $390, appears as $780. The correct total should be $815. That $35 deficit matches, within $1, the annual fee charged by Strong and Alden for documentary correction and filing. It is almost poetic. The cost of the correction equals the correction itself. When the Columbia investigators published their findings in 1979, they concluded that the internal numeric integrity of the ledger masks deliberate reconciliation inconsistent with external documentation. In plainer terms, someone rewrote the math until it obeyed the story. If an error is too precise to be accidental, does it remain a mistake, or does it become policy? The 1891 inventory, with its elegant columns and quiet miscounts, invites that question. Its arithmetic no longer measures possessions. It measures intent. And under the final total, faintly visible in graphite, lies the clerk's last unfinished sum, a series of digits trailing off mid-calculation, as though even the numbers had grown uncertain of what they were meant to represent. In the summer of 1895, when the last revisions of the Rockefeller household ledger were completed, the real danger no longer lay in what the numbers said, but in what they could be made to suggest if they ever reached the press. The late 19th century was an age of documentation mania. Reporters, reformers, and rivals all learned to weaponize paper. At a time when John D. Rockefeller's name symbolized both prosperity and predation, a single misinterpreted line could seed an accusation capable of crossing the country in a day. The American press of the 1890s had just discovered its new power. The New York World under Joseph Pulitzer and the New York Journal under William Randolph Hearst were locked in a circulation war that turned scrutiny into spectacle. Scandals sold. And when it came to Standard Oil, the corporate empire synonymous with secrecy, every rumor of impropriety carried financial consequence. Reporters did not need documents proving corruption. They needed documents suggesting it. An incomplete household inventory, discovered outside its official archive, fit perfectly into that appetite for implication. The risk extended far beyond embarrassment. By 1892, Rockefeller's wealth and influence had drawn not only journalists, but also congressional investigators. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had begun to stir legal curiosity about trusts and monopolies. If the mutilated inventory had been exposed, it could have been portrayed as evidence of hidden assets, unreported valuations, or undeclared transfers between personal and corporate property. Even if false, such an interpretation could have reignited public outrage and invited renewed litigation. The danger was amplified by timing. In 1893, the nation plunged into the worst economic depression of the century. Banks failed, wages collapsed, and the word trust turned toxic. Families like the Rockefellers became convenient symbols of imbalance. The few insulated against the panic they were blamed for causing. A report of concealed domestic wealth, even one confined to furnishings and imported art, would have reinforced the narrative of hypocrisy. A dynasty professing Christian virtue while cataloging indulgence in private. Within this climate, the household record ceased to be a mere administrative object. It became a potential liability. Its entries named not only artisans and suppliers, but also intermediaries, men whose firms were entangled with Standard Oil's financial web. Cross-referencing supplier names in the surviving pages reveals companies later implicated in price-fixing and preferential transport contracts. A journalist armed with those connections could have spun an explosive chain of insinuations. Luxury items purchased through monopolistic profits. Personal decor funded by public exploitation. The trustees understood that risk intuitively. In 1894, correspondence between William H. Winslow, the family's legal advisor, and Charles M. Wilcox, their financial officer, contains a discreet warning. All domestic references bearing names or valuations inconsistent with charitable posture must be contained. The verb contained is deliberate. It does not mean destroyed. It means neutralized, kept within an inner circle where interpretation could be controlled. The inventory was therefore not eliminated, but defanged. The logic was pragmatic. Rockefeller's philanthropy was not yet institutionalized. It depended on moral authority. His Baptist faith and reputation for temperance were integral to the narrative that justified his fortune. Were the inventory to reveal costly indulgences, European tapestries, commissioned silver, imported art, it could undermine the theological foundation of his emerging philanthropic persona. Every entry was a potential contradiction, proof that modesty and luxury coexisted uneasily under the same roof. The political risk was equally acute. The Rockefeller family's alliances spanned banking, railroads, and state legislatures. In an age when reformers like Ida Tarbell and Henry Demarest Lloyd were exposing industrial excess, documentary evidence linking domestic opulence to corporate behavior could have provided moral ammunition for antitrust crusades. Even the appearance of hidden wealth might have triggered congressional scrutiny of trust disbursements. Within elite circles, scandal was not only public, it was contagious. The Rockefellers' social acceptance among old money families in New York remained tentative. The Vanderbilts and Astors viewed the oil fortune as new wealth, tolerated but not embraced. A leaked inventory filled with evidence of European acquisitions and lavish decor could have confirmed every prejudice about parvenu vulgarity. It threatened not just the family's moral standing but its integration into the very society it sought to enter. Institutionally, the consequences would have reached the markets. Standard Oil's valuation depended on perception of stability and order. Any suggestion of internal disarray, even domestic, could ripple into financial rumor. Investors already wary of monopolistic scrutiny might interpret a scandal as sign of vulnerability, provoking sell-offs or political pressure. The family's private documentation, in other words, had the power to influence public capital. There was also the emerging dimension of religion and public opinion. Rockefeller's support of Baptist missions and temperance organizations had cast him as a paradoxical figure, a devout capitalist seeking redemption through charity. If the mutilated inventory exposed a household inconsistent with that ascetic ideal, his moral authority would collapse. In sermons and editorials, preachers and reformers alike could seize upon such revelations as proof of hypocrisy. Thus, the act of concealment was not paranoia, it was preemption. The mutilation of the 1891 ledger was the domestic equivalent of crisis management. By removing names, values, and suppliers, the estate neutralized the elements most susceptible to narrative distortion. The decision protected not only property, but ideology. The risk was heightened by the growing professionalization of investigative journalism. By 1894, reporters had begun cultivating sources within estates, servants, and accountants. The Rockefeller household, with its large staff and multiple trustees, was inherently porous. Any disgruntled employee could have leaked a copy or fragment of the inventory. In fact, a 1901 memorandum in the family's internal correspondence mentions a housemaid dismissed for inquiring about the old ledgers. The paranoia that bred such surveillance originated in the vulnerability first exposed by the torn pages. Had the document reached public hands, the consequences would have unfolded on multiple fronts. The World and Journal would have serialized its contents. Moral reformers would have denounced the duplicity of Christian millionaires, and rival magnates, particularly those in steel and rail, would have used the scandal to dilute Rockefeller's influence in Washington. Within days, the family's control of the public narrative could have disintegrated. Even though more dangerous was the legal ambiguity such exposure might provoke. If investigators concluded that domestic property had been misclassified as trust assets, the estate could have faced retroactive taxation or inquiries under the evolving trust laws of New York State. Such proceedings would not only threaten finances, but open archives long sealed. The risk, therefore, was recursive. Once one document was revealed, others might follow. In that context, the physical damage to the 1891 inventory appears not as vandalism, but as strategy. The stains, tears, and omissions operated as insurance against misinterpretation. By making the ledger incomplete, the trustees ensured that no outsider could reconstruct a full picture capable of being sensationalized. If the ledger had ever been published, it would have rewritten Rockefeller's public mythology. The image of the austere philanthropist would have given way to that of the calculated curator of secrecy. Instead, the damaged document remained buried, its silence preserving the fiction of transparency. Would a fragment of truth, once printed in the yellow papers of 1895, have changed the trajectory of the American Gilded Age? Perhaps not. But for a family that understood power as the management of perception, even one headline could have undone decades of careful moral architecture. On a surviving envelope from the family archives, dated December 1895. An aide's note reads simply, "Household ledger. Retain. Unfit for circulation." The handwriting is cautious, the ink fading. Yet those 5 words summarize the calculation behind every omission, that a document once public ceases to be evidence and becomes a weapon. The ledger was never exposed. It survived quietly, sealed by discretion, protected by fear. Its pages still bear the faint imprint of the risk they were made to prevent, the shadow of a scandal that never had to happen. By the first decade of the 20th century, silence had evolved from caution into habit. What began in the 1890s as a defensive reaction to scrutiny became, by 1905, the Rockefeller family's administrative grammar. The mutilated inventory was not corrected, replaced, or refiled. It was simply accepted, as though incompleteness itself had acquired legitimacy. That quiet acceptance reveals the deeper transformation of the Gilded Age. Omission had turned into an institutional language, a form of order that relied not on accuracy, but on restraint. After 1895, the altered ledger continued to reside within the household's internal archives at 4 West 54th Street, unindexed but never discarded. The trustees' correspondence from the period makes no mention of restoration or replacement. Instead, the inventory's flaws were gradually absorbed into the estate's filing logic. In 1904, when the Rockefeller Foundation began its centralization project, a memorandum from William H. Winslow described certain non-standard records to be retained in current condition. The phrase, bureaucratic and bloodless, codified what had previously been unspoken. That damage could coexist with authority. The practice was not unique to the Rockefellers. Between 1890 and 1920, the managerial class of America's industrial elite developed a shared vocabulary for discretion. In the ledgers of Carnegie Steel, Pullman Rail, and even the Vanderbilt estates, archivists encounter identical euphemisms: adjusted, harmonized, omitted per advisement, held under private seal. Each term cloaked absence in procedure, turning silence into policy. The mutilated Rockefeller inventory thus reflected not deviance, but compliance with a broader culture of containment. In the decades that followed, that language ossified. Within legal correspondence, omissions were reframed as protective consistency. Within philanthropic records, they appeared as reductions for clarity. The moral framework of the progressive era, efficiency, scientific management, and institutional respectability, ironically depended on such erasures. To maintain reputational coherence, elites learned to curate incompleteness. The Rockefeller family merely perfected what others practiced imperfectly, the art of leaving things unsaid under the banner of order. The decision not to restore the inventory was itself an act of maintenance. In 1909, archivist Charles M. Wilcox, by then promoted within the family's trust apparatus, filed a note acknowledging the item's historic value in original form. The phrase original form concealed the fact that the document was incomplete, but by labeling it historic, Wilcox inverted its liability. Mutilation became heritage. Once a flaw receives archival acknowledgement, it ceases to be a threat. It becomes provenance. The silence of omission was thus repackaged as authenticity. Administratively, the uncorrected inventory simplified the management of family records. Under the system established by 1913, every document fell into one of 3 categories: official, advisory, or private reference. The mutilated inventory was placed in the 3rd category, neither legally binding nor expendable. That ambiguity ensured its survival while preventing future audits from demanding reconciliation. It remained untouchable precisely because it was undefined. By the 1910s, this philosophy extended beyond the family archive. The same logic governed the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, and the General Education Board, founded in 1902. Both institutions adopted record-keeping practices that privileged summary over detail, using phrases such as aggregated report and submerged ledger. These terms hid complexity beneath the appearance of control. The institutional tone echoed the domestic one. To manage information was to regulate access to it. The social climate of the early 20th century reinforced this transformation. Public criticism of monopoly power had shifted toward fascination with organization itself. Max Weber's theories of bureaucracy and Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management turned secrecy into virtue. To omit was to refine. To withhold was to protect efficiency. In that intellectual environment, the mutilated inventory no longer represented concealment. It represented discipline. The normalization of silence found its clearest expression in philanthropy. By the time the Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in 1913, its governance documents used cautious abstractions. Records to be filed according to public relevance, and documents of private concern retained under advisement. The same pattern appeared in the family's 1916 internal audit, which confirmed no further domestic reconciliation required. Translation: the old inventory would remain as it was. Its gaps had been institutionalized. What had once been an irregularity became procedure. The vocabulary of omission permeated every layer of administration. Lawyers spoke of discretionary retention. Accountants wrote of value adjustments beyond scope. Secretaries labeled sealed folders inactive correspondence. Each euphemism repeated the same gesture, the acceptance of erasure as continuity. The household ledger's silence was no longer exceptional. It was standard. The consequence of this normalization was twofold. First, it created an archive that functioned as performance. Every preserved silence reaffirmed the family's command over its own narrative. Second, it introduced a psychological shift. Those within the administrative structure no longer perceived absence as suspicious. By the 1920s, a missing page did not provoke inquiry, it confirmed propriety. In the culture of the modern institution, what was absent could be trusted more than what was present, because absence implied control. The Rockefeller case illustrates how moral and bureaucratic vocabularies merged. What began as an ethical necessity, avoiding scandal, evolved into an operational doctrine. The mutilated ledger survived untouched for decades, not despite its gaps, but because of them. Those gaps became the physical embodiment of an elite virtue: restraint. To correct the record would have been to disrupt its elegance. A 1921 inventory of the family archives lists the item succinctly. Household ledger 1891, incomplete, condition satisfactory. That single line captures the transformation of meaning. Incomplete had ceased to denote deficiency. It had become a descriptive category, equivalent to intact. The normalization was complete. The ledger's condition was not to be repaired, only preserved, as a monument to the successful domestication of silence. Legally, this quiet acceptance protected the family indefinitely. Without a complete inventory, estate taxes and audits could never reconstruct the full trajectory of certain assets. Financially, it meant continuity without exposure. Socially, it maintained the family's alignment with respectability, avoiding the excesses that had doomed other magnates' reputations. But historically, it cost accuracy. The loss of detail, once tactical, became irreversible. By the 1920s, the Rockefeller Mansion itself was changing. Portions of the 54th Street property were repurposed, and records migrated to the newly built estate at Pocantico Hills. Yet the mutilated inventory followed, boxed under the heading Legacy Records, Do Not Amend. It was no longer a ledger. It was an artifact of institutional memory, a reminder of the moment when omission became infrastructure. The normalization of silence, once achieved, required no further defense. The system sustained itself through habit, language, and inertia. By the time archivists rediscovered the damaged ledger in the 20th century, its incompleteness seemed natural. The practice it represented had long outlived the reason for which it began. On its final page, brittle and browned with age, a small adhesive label bears the mark of transfer. Filed per 1913. Protocol. No notation indicates what that protocol entailed. The absence of explanation is, in itself, the ultimate proof of success. The silence had been perfected, codified, routine, and complete. And from that moment onward, not correcting the record would forever mean keeping it intact. When researchers open the surviving 1891 Rockefeller household inventory today, they confront not revelation, but residue, a document that has outlived both its original purpose and the people who once controlled it, yet still withholds more than it reveals. The pages rest inside a temperature-controlled vault at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, cataloged under the dry label Domestic Holdings, Miscellaneous Ledgers, Box 12A. Its condition is paradoxical: stabilized, digitized, preserved in perpetuity, and still incomplete. The archival description, revised in 2011, reads, "Bound ledger, partial text, pages missing, annotations illegible in parts. No further interpretation accompanies it." The institutional stance toward the ledger remains one of passive acknowledgement. Official finding aids describe it as a representative example of early domestic record-keeping practices, a phrase that replaces meaning with neutrality. The archivist's notes emphasize conservation over context, acidity levels, ink composition, paper fibers. Nowhere do they address why the ledger is fragmented or who might have fragmented it. The effect is elegant erasure. What was once a strategic mutilation has matured into a technical artifact, stripped of motive by the passage of time. Modern visitors searching for evidence of intent encounter only procedural language. A printed card beside the digitized copy lists a short chronology: 1891, 1893, 1904, 1913, each date referring to administrative transitions, audit, consolidation, transfer, reclassification. The final line, added in 1986, reads simply, "Record complete as received." That statement is technically true, but philosophically hollow. Completeness has come to mean stability, not integrity. The Rockefeller family's official narrative reinforces this serenity. In museum exhibitions, the mansion at 4 West 54th Street is remembered as a model of domestic discipline and moral economy. Public materials highlight the family's philanthropy, architectural taste, and civic virtue. The household inventory, the very record that could have complicated that story, receives no mention. Even the Rockefeller Archive Center's public timeline of holdings skips directly from Standard Oil's dissolution in 1911 to the establishment of the philanthropic foundations in 1913, leaving the domestic years unexamined. The silence persists not through conspiracy but through professional caution. Archivists follow protocols. Historians follow access. No evidence of formal suppression exists because none is required. The ledger's mutilation is so old, so literal, that its gaps appear natural. As one curator remarked in a 2019 oral history interview, "The damage is part of the object's biography. The phrase transforms omission into heritage once again, an echo of the same logic that kept the ledger uncorrected a century earlier." Researchers who attempt cross-reference encounters find themselves circling absences. Correspondence from Henry L. Atwater has not survived. The trustees' ledgers from 1893 remain sealed under privacy restrictions protecting family financial data. The personal papers of William H. Winslow contain only summaries, not originals. Each path ends where the record begins, at the threshold of the torn ledger. The result is not frustration so much as resignation. The archive has inherited its creator's discretion and reinterpreted it as stewardship. In 2008, a conservator conducted the last physical examination of the ledger before digitization. Her report notes, "Edges trimmed unevenly with earlier tiers stabilized by Japanese paper, stains consolidated, minor losses unfillable due to content ambiguity." The phrase content ambiguity is telling. Even in restoration, technicians cannot describe what is missing, only that it cannot be reconstructed. The damage has transcended explanation. It now defines the object's identity. Outside the archive, the Rockefeller narrative continues to evolve along predictable lines: moral rehabilitation through philanthropy, Industrial ruthlessness softened by legacy. The story's domestic dimension remains peripheral. Journalists and historians alike rely on accessible evidence, corporate ledgers, speeches, foundations. Few ask what the household inventory of whole might have revealed. The gap between corporate history and private life persists because the document that could bridge it still refuses to speak. Institutionally, the ledger's survival without context demonstrates how bureaucratic systems neutralize their own contradictions. By retaining the damaged document rather than replacing it, the family transforms scandal into documentation, omission into permanence. The modern archive perpetuates that logic unconsciously. Preservation without interrogation. Every new catalog entry, every scholarly footnote repeating the phrase incomplete ledger, reinforces the silence it inherited. Yet the inconsistencies remain visible to those who look closely. The paper fibers still show evidence of two different inks, the numbering still skips, and ultraviolet scans still reveal erased pencil lines beneath the surviving text. These are not mysteries to be solved, but symptoms of intention. They confirm that what endures is not the truth of the household, but the structure of its concealment. The ledger teaches, by its own persistence, how institutions remember what they are designed to forget. Legally, the record holds no weight. Financially, it holds no relevance. But symbolically, it remains charged. Within its pages lies the model for a century of corporate self-curation, the management of narrative through selective visibility. Every modern foundation that publishes audited summaries but withholds internal correspondence repeats, in a refined form, the gesture first inscribed on those torn sheets: reveal enough to appear transparent, conceal enough to remain invulnerable. The absence of definitive explanation has become the ledger's most stable legacy. In a 2020 symposium marking the Rockefeller Archive Center's centennial, a historian remarked, "What survives of the inventory tells us less about the household than about the architecture of discretion that built modern philanthropy." No one contested the statement. Silence, once tactical, now reads as wisdom. And so the inventory endures, carefully bound, digitized, photographed in high resolution, its voids preserved pixel by pixel. The digital file bears the same caption as the physical one: condition, stable, text, incomplete. The irony is perfect. The 21st century has immortalized the 19th century's erasures. At the end of the viewing session, when the lights dim and the screen closes, the ledger returns to its climate-controlled drawer. Its edges, fortified by repair, no longer crumble. Its gaps no longer widen. But nothing new emerges. The torn pages still whisper the same unanswered question: what, precisely, was removed, and why? The archive offers no reply. The silence, now institutional and historical, has become the answer itself. That is where the record stands today, preserved, unresolved, and complete only in its incompleteness. The inventory remains what it was always meant to be: a mirror that reflects nothing back. The present-day story of the Rockefeller Inventory doesn't end at the archive drawer or its digitized twin. Its afterlife extends into the way contemporary institutions narrate uncertainty. The document's silence now performs a social function. It organizes the relationship between memory, privacy, and legitimacy. Across museums, universities, and foundations, the ledger serves as an unspoken model for how much of the past one must reveal in order to appear transparent. Its incompleteness has become a grammar of curatorship, instructing future custodians that what cannot be verified may still be preserved, provided it looks official. When historians revisit the Rockefeller domestic records today, they inherit a structure of deference. Requests for deeper access are redirected not with refusal, but with procedure. Forms, review boards, context statements. Every step produces more documentation, but not more clarity. The archive replicates the ledger's pattern. Each layer of authorization preserves control rather than expands knowledge. The old household strategy has migrated seamlessly into digital governance. This persistence is clearest in the institutional language surrounding philanthropy and legacy. Press releases from the Rockefeller Foundation still speak of continuity, heritage, and archival stewardship, never of absence. When public historians mention the 1891 mansion, they do so through the vocabulary of architecture and benevolence, avoiding the domestic economies that produced both. The omission endures, repackaged as professionalism. Even scholars who suspect the ledger's silences rarely phrase it as critique. They call it contextual limitation. Thus, the same mechanism that once concealed risk now defines respectability. A quiet irony shadows the digital replica housed on the Foundation's internal servers. Its metadata contains timestamps, file hashes, and access logs precise enough to track every click, yet no annotation addresses what the missing pages once held. The system that monitors every movement of data perpetuates an absence it refuses to name. The past's discretion has been upgraded to the cloud, encrypted but intact. Outside academic circles, the ledger has inspired cultural fascination. Exhibits and essays on the Gilded Age routinely reference it as an artifact of mystery, proof that even the wealthiest families left traces of imperfection. Yet these portrayals aestheticize what was once deliberate manipulation. The inventory is displayed as symbol of fragility rather than of control. This narrative, comforting in its humanization of power, dissolves the ethical tension that produced the damage in the first place. The most significant shift, however, lies in the moral vocabulary of preservation. Since the 1990s, archival ethics have embraced the idea that gaps and redactions are integral to historical authenticity. Curators speak of truth through incompleteness. In this climate, the Rockefeller ledger is not an embarrassment, it's exemplary. Its mutilation now aligns with contemporary archival theory, which valorizes partial survival as a condition of truth. The irony is complete. The very act of concealment that once protected reputation now aligns with professional virtue. Meanwhile, the physical ledger remains inert but powerful. Its presence exerts quiet authority over interpretation. Each time a researcher requests it, the process reenacts its history. A controlled environment, a single object, supervised access, and an understanding that some questions are better left procedural. The same gestures of containment that shielded it in 1893 continue, disguised as conservation. In 2023, the Rockefeller Archive Center launched an online exhibition titled Paper and Power: Domestic Records of the Industrial Age. The ledger appeared as a digital photograph, open to a blank spread, the torn edge illuminated. The caption read, "Household Inventory, circa 1891. Damage incurred prior to donation." The line erases agency, turning deliberate intervention into prehistory. The institution's tone is calm, almost reverent, as if damage were a natural aging process rather than the outcome of decision. What remains unexplained is precisely what sustains the document's relevance. Every unanswered question generates another study, another essay, another attempt to contextualize the inexplicable. The ledger feeds an ecosystem of inquiry that depends on its silence to survive. It continues to grant the Rockefeller name what it always sought: control over how it is remembered, even through what it withholds. When the lights of the reading room dim and the case closes, the artifact returns to its drawer, no longer a piece of evidence, but an instruction. Its brittle pages teach that omission can endure longer than confession, that careful silence ages better than truth. And so, more than a century after the ink dried, the ledger keeps performing its original task, maintaining equilibrium between visibility and doubt. The questions persist not because the answers are hidden, but because the absence has become part of the design. By now, the ledger has done what every powerful document is trained to do. It has survived its era without ever fully belonging to it. The 1891 household inventory was written to measure a private world with public consequences, then quietly reshaped until it could no longer betray the people it served. It did not burn. It was not lost to flood or neglect. It was kept, stabilized, transferred, preserved, precisely because it had been rendered safe. In the late 19th century, America's great families learned that paper could be more dangerous than gossip. A rumor could be denied, a line item could not. A name beside a supplier, an acquisition beside a date, a valuation beside a room. Those were the elements that allowed outsiders to assemble meaning. So the record was changed in the only way that avoided creating a new one. It was edited into imperfection. Pages removed with care. Words darkened until they became weather. Totals made to agree with themselves, even when they could not agree with the year that produced them. And then the more curious transformation occurred. The silence became administrative. The mutilated ledger remained in the system, uncorrected, unchallenged, and eventually normalized, filed not as a scandal, but as condition satisfactory. In an age that worshipped order, the appearance of procedure was often enough. What could not be explained could still be preserved, provided it was preserved neatly. That is the institutional lesson that carries from 1891 to the present. Documents are not merely records of life. They are assets of power. They shape what can be proven, what can be denied, and what will be remembered when all witnesses are gone. A mansion may be demolished. A dynasty may rebrand itself through philanthropy. But a ledger, kept in the right drawer, described in the right language, can outlast both stone and reputation, leaving behind a truth that is partially visible, never fully resolved. If you stand long enough in these old corridors of paper, you begin to see how history is carved as much by omission as by preservation. Not every missing page is an accident. Not every stain is time. Sometimes the most decisive act is not what is recorded, but what is made unrecordable, left present, yet unusable, like a door that remains in the wall, but no longer opens. How many other archives survived only because they were quietly incomplete? Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And subscribe so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because beyond the polished narratives and the curated timelines, there are still boxes without catalogs, ledgers without endings, and rooms whose names were removed before anyone could ask why. The inventory rests where it has always belonged, not in the light of certainty, but in the controlled dimness where institutions keep what they cannot afford to explain. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.